"He who forgets the past is condemned to repeat it." That quote, echoing from George Santayana, is perhaps the key to unlocking this book. For if we merely view history as a list of battles, treaties, or events, we miss the profound essence: how a civilized society can plunge into an abyss, and how seemingly ordinary individuals can transform into agents of global catastrophe. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is not merely a monumental work of documentation. It is the endeavor of an eyewitness, William Shirer, who observed from within Germany, living in an oppressive atmosphere where power and propaganda intertwined with every breath. The book reconstructs the entire panorama, from the chaotic early days of the Weimar Republic, through Hitler's rise and consolidation of power, to the war's peak and the catastrophic dissolution in the Berlin bunker. Yet, beneath the surface of these events, what truly haunts is the question: how could a nation, proud of its intellect, art, and philosophy, become an instrument of a bloodthirsty regime? Perhaps it is here that this work transcends the scope of a mere chronicle. It speaks not only of Germany, of the 20th century, but also poses universal questions for us. How can a single individual ignite collective hysteria? How does silence and minor compromises gradually accumulate into historical tragedy? And the greatest paradox: is it precisely the more confident we are that our society is immune to dictatorship, the easier it is for the seeds of tyranny to sprout? When you open this book, you will not only encounter campaign maps, names of generals, or speeches, you will confront a mirror. It forces us to re-examine ourselves, our societies, the weaknesses and illusions of humanity before power, and a lingering question for each reader. If history were to knock again one day, would you be the one to stand up and stop it, or would you be silent in the crowd? On a cold morning at the end of January 1933, Berlin was in turmoil with news everyone felt was imminent. The Weimar Republic had collapsed in helplessness, and a man of obscure origins was about to step onto the stage of power. On January 30th, Adolf Hitler left the Kaiserhof Hotel to meet Hindenburg. This man, once considered a failure, a common soldier, an unknown in Munich, a hungry wanderer in Vienna, now entered the Chancellor's residence. From a window opposite, Wells and his companions watched his face for the outcome, and they saw wet eyes, shoulders trembling with emotion. A new era had begun. That evening, a parade with tens of thousands of blazing torches tore through the night. The rhythmic thud of hobnailed boots echoed on Wilhelmstrasse, interspersed with the hoarse Wessel song, creating a sensation that Germany was rediscovering its strength. From the balcony, Hindenburg raised his stick in rhythm, while from the chancellery window, Hitler eagerly raised his hand in salute, openly weeping a moment proclaimed as 1,000 years, but lasting only 12 years and 4 months. To understand this storm, we must trace back to the origins of the man who had just seized power. Hitler was born in 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small town precisely on the border between Austria and Bavaria. This border haunted him his entire life. In Mein Kampf, his very first lines declared that the coincidence of his birthplace heralded his mission to unite the two German-speaking peoples. His family were impoverished peasants. His father, Alois Hitler, was once known as Skickelgruber, only changing his surname to Hitler after a late legitimization. His mother, Clara, was gentle, kind, and for Adolf, his sole emotional anchor. His adolescence in Linz revealed a strong rebellious streak. His father wanted him to pursue a civil service career, but the 11-year-old boy rebelled, saying, "Never." His academic performance plummeted. Teachers criticized him, while inwardly a different ambition burned: to become an artist. His years at Lambach Abbey, with its music and ancient symbols, left a strange imprint, yet all of it only further fueled his internal conflicts. A dropout who hated school but voraciously devoured books on German history and mythology. In 1907, Hitler arrived in Vienna with hopes of entering the Academy of Fine Arts. He carried an absolute belief in his own talent, but the admissions committee coldly rejected him, pointing out his lack of skill in drawing figures, possessing only some architectural ability. Failure followed failure. His second attempt was even worse. Around that time, his mother fell gravely ill and died in late 1908. The shock left the 19-year-old adrift, without education, profession, or family support. Vienna became the darkest period of his life, from 1909 to 1913. Hitler drifted between squalid boarding houses, often relying on charity kitchens. Food was a constant obsession. Hunger and thirst were my most loyal companions. To survive, he painted small pictures, usually architecture, churches, streets, selling them to passers-by or framing them in cheap frames. But in parallel, another spiritual world was forming. He read mountains of books on history, race, and politics. In dim rooms, extremist ideas took root. Vienna was Hitler's ideological forge. He loathed the multi-ethnic parliament of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, seeing it as a manifestation of decay. He disdained Slavs, especially Czechs, viewing them as inferior. Simultaneously, he began to absorb the anti-Semitic theories proliferating from right-wing newspapers to public forums. In the eyes of the impoverished failure, Jews gradually became the symbol of all the causes of his personal suffering and the nation's weakness. Yet, beneath this ideology lay a paradox. A man who hated manual labor yearned for absolute power. A man who never succeeded in art nevertheless believed he was destined to recreate the nation. In the shabby poverty of Vienna, the image of a leader was conceived, not from victory, but from accumulating failures, from humiliation before modern society, from blind faith in a historical mission he bestowed upon himself. Leaving Vienna in despair, Hitler arrived in Munich in 1913. This city offered him a completely different atmosphere, imbued with a strong German supremacist spirit, more orderly, less chaotic than Vienna. Here, he lived quietly on the meager earnings from his cheap paintings until World War I erupted in August 1914. Hitler volunteered for military service. For him, war was not merely a duty but an opportunity to prove himself, to find meaning in life. During 4 years of war, Hitler served in a Bavarian infantry regiment. He carried an absolute loyalty to Germany, despite many still considering him an outsider due to his Austrian origin. War gave him discipline, camaraderie, and a rare sense of pride when he received the Iron Cross. But simultaneously, war instilled in him a deep obsession with defeat and betrayal. In November 1918, when Germany surrendered, Hitler lay in a hospital, wounded by gas. From within the haze, he heard news of the army's dissolution, the Kaiser's abdication, and the new government signing an armistice. This shock was etched into his mind. For him, Germany had not lost on the battlefield but was stabbed in the back by civilian politicians and traitors. The feeling of being robbed of victory became the source of an enduring hatred, which he would later transmit to millions. After the war, Germany plunged into crisis. The Treaty of Versailles compelled the nation to pay heavy reparations, cede territory, limit its military. Inflation, unemployment, and poverty besieged the country. In this context, Hitler found his political path. In 1919, he joined the German Workers' Party, a small, little-known group. But at meetings in Munich beer halls, his oratorical talent exploded, his voice full of emphasis, his eyes burning. His ability to awaken resentment captivated the crowds. It was in the beer smoke and fervent shouts that the image of Germany's savior began to form. From here, the party was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or commonly known as the Nazi Party. Hitler was not just a hero on the podium, he also created symbols, the red flag with a white circle and black swastika, a simple yet haunting image. Simultaneously, the SA, stormtroopers, the brown-shirted force, was organized, specialized in street violence to terrorize opponents, sow fear, and gain dominance. From 1920 to 1923, the Nazi Party grew rapidly. The unemployed, bankrupt small traders, abandoned war veterans all found in Hitler an explanation for their hardships. Jews, communists, the Weimar government. He became the one who could name the enemy. The climax came in November 1923 with the beer hall putsch. In a frenzy, Hitler and his accomplices surrounded the hall where Bavarian leaders were meeting. With pistols raised, he declared the Weimar government overthrown and called for a national uprising. But reality was different. State-loyal troops quickly suppressed the rebellion. The putsch ended in chaos, blood on the streets, and Hitler's arrest. The 1923 failure seemed to end his political career. Many mocked the dreamer who wanted to replicate Mussolini's march on Rome and Italy. Yet, in his cell at Landsberg prison, Hitler found another opportunity. There, he spent time writing, or rather dictating to Rudolf Hess, Mein Kampf. On its pages, he mapped out the future, rearming Germany, expanding territory eastward, annihilating Jews, crushing communism, and building a thousand-year empire. Mein Kampf became the handbook for his entire subsequent political journey. His prison sentence lasted only 9 months, and upon his release, Hitler had changed his strategy. No longer hasty revolts, but a slow path using elections, propaganda, and law to infiltrate the government, then destroy it from within. In his Landsberg cell, Hitler not only penned the turgid lines of Mein Kampf, but also reorganized his entire life and political vision. This was not a memoir or literature, but a dramatic manifesto, where he sketched a distorted, extreme, and uncompromising worldview. The focus revolved around 2 ideas: the historical mission of the German people and the necessity of annihilating racial enemies. He believed humanity was divided into inherent hierarchies, with Aryans epitomized by tall, blonde, blue-eyed figures considered the creative race, leading civilization. In opposition were the Jews, whom he assigned the role of destroyers, parasitic, controlling finance, media, and corrupting culture. In Hitler's eyes, they embodied a danger that had to be eradicated. And alongside were the Slavs, the numerous communities in Eastern Europe whom he considered inferior, fit only for servitude. From this arose the concept he repeatedly emphasized: Lebensraum, living space. Germany, he believed, was confined within narrow borders, shackled by Versailles. The future held only one path: advance eastward, seize the vast territories of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, transforming these fertile lands into farms to sustain the superior race. This was both an imperial ideal and a justification for inevitable war. But beyond racial and territorial ideology, Mein Kampf also reflected a soul obsessed with absolute power. Hitler argued that democracy was merely a facade of decay, creating opportunities for weakness and betrayal. The only thing that could revive the nation was a single leader, one who never compromised, who possessed an iron will, who was chosen by history. And of course, he placed himself in that position. After his release from prison, Hitler began to rebuild the Nazi Party according to a model of iron discipline. Experiences from the 1923 failure taught him a lesson. To seize power, a legal facade was needed. Therefore, the party no longer rushed into rebellion, but participated in elections, built organizations, and expanded propaganda through newspapers, slogans, and symbols used as spiritual weapons. Each meeting transformed into a ritual where the crowd not only listened to speeches, but was drawn into a collective frenzy. Here, we clearly see the sophistication of Hitler's control over mass psychology. He understood the humiliation of the 1918 defeat, the injustice of Versailles, the fear of losing jobs and dignity. He offered no complex analyses, only pointing out common enemies: Jews, communists, the Weimar government, and promising a resurrected Germany. The crowd found faith in this simplicity, and they were willing to surrender both their reason and freedom to him. Alongside language and symbols, he employed controlled violence. The SA, and later the SS, simultaneously sowed fear and created a sense of order. Street clashes and assaults on opponents were transformed into evidence that only the Nazi Party could protect the nation. In the combination of grand meetings and covert terror, Hitler's power gradually became a reality. What made this process particularly dangerous was Hitler's absolute belief in his own destiny. He saw himself not merely as a politician, but as an instrument of history. In his words and gaze, there was a rare fanaticism, a belief that he bore a divine mission, that every setback was merely a temporary retreat before fate cleared the path. This blind self-confidence, coupled with his ability to captivate crowds, allowed him to overcome all obstacles. By the end of this period, Germany had a ticking time bomb within its heart. A man from the bottom of society, who once wandered hungry on the streets of Vienna, transformed into the leader of a political movement growing stronger every day. The combination of extreme personal will, anti-Semitic ideology, territorial ambition, and the art of manipulating the masses had laid the foundation for an empire. It was not success but failure and destitution that forged Hitler's political character from a school failure, a young man rejected by the Art Academy, a poverty-stricken wanderer, an unsuccessful rebel. All these wounds were recycled into an unprecedented lust for power. As he entered the 1930s, the path was clear. From one distorted individual, Germany would plunge into the maelstrom of a new empire. After his days in Landsberg prison, with the manuscript of Mein Kampf still hot on his desk, Hitler re-entered real life with a decisive resolution: no repeat of the recklessness of 1923. The Munich failure taught him that pistols and riots could not bring down a state that still possessed military strength. From now on, the path would be legal illegality tinged with irony, as the law would be used as a ladder to ascend, then kicked away. The post-prison reconstruction began with restoring the Nazi Party, which had fragmented after the failed putsch. Many members were disillusioned, some defected to other movements. Hitler returned, using the very aura from his trial to reassert his role as the sole leader. He established strict disciplinary rules. All power was concentrated in his hands. Committees and branches had to be absolutely subservient. From this point, the Nazi Party became a vertical structure, no longer a loose group of political adventurers. The legal strategy quickly took shape. Instead of plotting coups, the party focused its efforts on elections, parliamentary representation, and mass organizations. Hitler understood that each vote was both a tool for legitimization and a weapon to deepen the crisis. The party crafted concise, simple slogans, easy to engrave on minds: restore Germany, overthrow Versailles, defeat Jews and communists. No complex theories were needed, only the sowing of hatred and the promise of revival. Simultaneously, a complete reorganization was implemented. A dedicated press machine was established, with the Völkischer Beobachter becoming the primary tool for disseminating messages. Meetings were not just speeches, but collective rituals: torchlight, red flags with swastikas, marching music, fervent shouts. All created the illusion that participants were part of something greater than themselves. The SA, nurtured from disgruntled veterans and unemployed youth, turned the streets into small battlefields where clashes simultaneously showcased strength and instilled fear. Hitler's oratorical power was an irreplaceable pillar. He appeared on stage not as a politician reading a text, but as an incendiary speaker, pouring energy into every word, every pause. The crowd was led through a crescendo, fueled from indignation to exhilaration, ending with the belief that there was only one way out: through him. On evenings in Munich halls, thousands jostled to hear the old refrain: Germany had been betrayed, but Germany would rise again. Equally important was the social front the party targeted. Not the elite, nor just the workers, but precisely the middle classes crushed by inflation and crisis-bankrupt small traders, civil servants who lost their status, impoverished farmers. They were a vast bloc seeking explanations. The Nazi Party offered them specific enemies: Jews, communists, international financiers, and also presented them with the image of a solution: an iron-willed leader, a new order, a Germany reborn. From 1925 to the early 1930s, the Nazi Party transformed from a ridiculed group into an organized political force. They established branches nationwide, created youth and women's networks, and pseudo-unions in every field. The party created parallel structures to challenge the legal state. All roads ultimately led to the center: Hitler. During this period, he did not yet hold national power, but the foundation had been laid. While Germany thought it was controlling a small extremist group, a propaganda and organizational machine was actually growing within society. Latent resentment, public insecurity, and the yearning for a savior-all converged under the swastika flag. In the early 1930s, Germany plunged into a comprehensive crisis. The 1929 global economic crisis swept through, shattering an economy already weakened by war. Banks collapsed, businesses went bankrupt, unemployment exceeded 6 million. Streets were filled with ragged, jobless people, peddlers, and bread lines. Meanwhile, the already shaky democratic political system was nearly paralyzed. Governments successively fell, relying on emergency decrees, no longer based on parliamentary consensus. In this land of despair, the Nazi Party rose like a new banner. Votes reflected the anger. From a small fringe group, they skyrocketed to become the largest force in the Reichstag within a few years. Giant rallies, speeches that ignited hope, turned Hitler into the choice of millions who wanted to believe that Germany could reclaim its strength. In 1932, Hitler decided to directly contend for the presidency. His opponent was Hindenburg, the old field marshal who commanded the army in World War I, a conservative symbol of Germany. Hindenburg still won, but Hitler garnered over 13 million votes, capturing 37% nationwide. This defeat, paradoxically, was a psychological victory. A man who once wandered Vienna was now a national candidate, seen by millions as the future leader. Meanwhile, power negotiations took place in the shadows. Conservative politicians like Franz von Papen believed they could use Hitler as a tool to draw the masses to their side, then contain him within a coalition government. They underestimated him, viewing him only as a good orator, lacking the substance to govern. And this very arrogance opened the door to the turning point. In late 1932, the Nazi Party temporarily weakened, losing votes in an election. Many believed the Hitler wave had passed, but the situation quickly changed. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg was compelled to appoint Hitler as chancellor, heading a government in which most ministers were not Nazis. The political and economic elite believed they would hold the reins, while Hitler would be merely a puppet for the public. But in reality, from day one, Hitler knew how to transform that position into a springboard to dismantle the entire old structure. The turning point of early 1933 came swiftly. Just weeks after taking office, the Reichstag fire occurred. A communist was arrested, and immediately the Nazi government exploited this incident to issue emergency decrees, suspending fundamental freedoms, allowing detention without trial, censoring the press, and monitoring mail. This was the first step in transforming a state of law into an instrument of oppression. In March 1933, the Enabling Act was passed in an atmosphere of intimidation, with SA forces surrounding the Reichstag and many opposition parliamentarians banned or arrested. This act granted Hitler absolute legislative power, bypassing the Reichstag, effectively legalizing dictatorship. In just a few weeks, the entire democracy collapsed, without a coup, without gunfire. From then on, the foundation for Gleichschaltung, coordination, began to form. States were stripped of their autonomy, opposition media was silenced, independent trade unions were disbanded. The entire society was steered onto a single trajectory, where every organization and institution had to submit to the Nazi Party. In the eyes of many Germans at the time, order seemed to be returning. Street violence gradually decreased, and the economy promised to revive thanks to public works and rearmament programs. But the price was the complete eradication of all political freedoms and the total concentration of power in the hands of a man once seen as an outsider. After the Enabling Act passed, the door to democracy slammed shut. From then on, every segment of German society was brought into a new, uniform orbit. Gleichschaltung became a comprehensive campaign. States lost their autonomy, local parliaments were dissolved, Nazi governors were appointed. Social organizations were successively transformed into instruments of subservience. Independent trade unions were dissolved, replaced by the German Labor Front under party direction, where all workers were forced to join. The press, arts, and publishing were all placed under censorship, with Joseph Goebbels building a colossal propaganda machine. The assertion of power occurred not only externally, but also within the internal party apparatus. The SA, once a street-level tool, began to pose a threat. Ernst Röhm and the brown-shirted leaders dreamed of a second revolution, wanting to replace the traditional army with their militia. This terrified the military and conservative circles. In the summer of 1934, Hitler acted. In the night of the Long Knives, hundreds of SA leaders were arrested or shot dead. Röhm himself was summarily executed. With this blow, Hitler not only eliminated an internal threat, but also demonstrated his allegiance to the army. When Hindenburg died in August of the same year, Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor, proclaiming himself Führer, legalizing absolute power. On a societal level, the restructuring of life proceeded at an urgent pace. Youth were organized into the Hitler Youth, where discipline, militarization, and ideological propaganda were paramount. Young women were placed in separate organizations, learning to serve the family and nurture Germany's new generation. School education was transformed into a tool for planting ideology. History was rewritten in a nationalist spirit. Biology became racial doctrine. Culture and art were forced to serve the German people, eliminating what was deemed degenerate, from modern paintings and jazz music to Jewish works. Relations with the church presented another paradox. Initially, The regime signed a concordat with the Vatican to appease Catholic public opinion, but simultaneously, many priests were arrested, churches were monitored, and Catholic youth were forced to join Nazi organizations. Traditional religions were restricted, replaced by a new faith centered around the leader and the nation. In daily life, propaganda permeated every corner. Radio became a pervasive medium. Every family was expected to own a receiver to hear Hitler's speeches echoing through loudspeakers. Films, newspapers, and festivals were all used to create an illusion of unity. The entire society seemed to be drawn into a collective performance where loyalty was measured by the intensity of the Heil Hitler shouts. At the same time, policies toward Jews began to shift from rhetoric to law. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 defined who was Jewish, stripped them of citizenship, and forbade marriage or relations with pure-blooded Germans. Jewish businesses were boycotted, Jewish doctors, lawyers, and teachers were removed from their professions. This was a shift from social discrimination to legal exclusion, paving the way for more brutal policies later on. For many Germans, the outward appearance offered a sense of order and recovery. Streets were safer. Unemployment decreased thanks to public works programs and rearmament. The nation seemed to rediscover its pride. Swastika flags flew everywhere, but the price was that the entire society was locked in a circle of control. Every dissenting voice was stifled, and people grew accustomed to living in a world with only one single truth, the truth dictated by the party. The period from 1930 through 1937 revealed a paradoxical picture. On the surface, a country seemingly revived, but beneath, dictatorial mechanisms, exclusion, and hatred had become its foundation. From here, the Third Reich entered a new phase, not just consolidating power, but also preparing for the path to war. Having transformed Germany into a totalitarian state, Hitler did not stop at internal control. The months after 1934 were a period when he tested international limits, systematically breaking the Versailles Order. Open rearmament was the opening move. Previously, the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from building an air force and limited its army to only 100,000 men. Now, Hitler announced the existence of a new air force, the Luftwaffe, and reinstituted compulsory military service. In one stroke, all post-war international commitments were thrown into the dustbin. Reactions from Britain and France were weak, merely protests without accompanying action. The message was clear. International law no longer had binding power, only awaiting someone bold enough to break it. The Rhineland in 1936 was the second test. The Treaty of Versailles stipulated this region must be demilitarized to prevent Germany from threatening France. Yet, in March of that year, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a still weak and fragile force. Hitler himself confessed that if French troops counterattacked, he would be forced to retreat. But that did not happen. Paris remained silent. London hesitated. No one acted. This timidity gave Hitler absolute confidence. Each gamble he won, and from then on, the tactic of high stakes became his guiding principle. Put everything on the table, because the opponent would not dare to play to the end. Parallel to military moves, Germany participated in the Spanish Civil War when Franco rebelled against the Republican government. Hitler sent the Condor Legion to assist, simultaneously testing weapons and training tactics. The bombings of Guernica not only sowed death, but also became a dress rehearsal for the coming war. This was also an opportunity for Berlin and Rome to find common ground. Mussolini, who had previously been wary of Hitler, now recognized a synergy. The two fascist regimes could support each other. In late 1936, the Rome-Berlin axis was officially proclaimed, creating a new Allied axis that reshaped Europe. But these years also witnessed a fateful internal crisis within the military. Defense Minister Blomberg and Army Commander-in-Chief Fritsch had been pillars. They supported rearmament, but were cautious about premature war ambitions. In early 1938, scandals and accusations were fabricated, forcing both to resign. This was a cleverly orchestrated fall to allow Hitler to remove obstacles in the command ranks. Simultaneously, H. Hjalmar Schacht, the economic architect, and Konstantin von Neurath, the foreign minister, were also sidelined for no longer fitting the pace of aggression. Political, military, and diplomatic power contracted around a small circle, with Hitler at the center and Göring and Ribbentrop as his two trusted lieutenants. Looking at the overall picture, we see a series of paradoxes. Germany was not yet strong enough to launch a long war, but Hitler consistently took bold steps and each time was met with appeasement. Each success further solidified his illusion of destiny. From a country shackled by Versailles, in just a few years, Germany possessed a powerful army, reoccupied strategic territory, gained international allies, and removed obstacles within its leadership. The period 1934–1937 was when the chessboard was rearranged, with every piece in Hitler's favor. These preparatory steps not only shook Europe, but also fostered a new mindset in German society. Propaganda continuously praised bloodless victories, leading the populace to believe their leader could bring the country to glory without sacrifice. This created a dangerous consensus, where an entire nation grew accustomed to international law being trampled and war becoming an accepted prospect. After a series of bloodless victories, Hitler believed destiny had chosen him to expand the borders. The next target was Austria, his old homeland, which he was obsessed with incorporating into Germany. For months, Hitler pressured the Vienna government, forcing Chancellor Schuschnigg to make concessions. When Schuschnigg planned a plebiscite to affirm independence, Hitler decided to act first. In March 1938, German troops crossed the border. The Anschluss occurred amidst a mixed scene of political violence and joyous crowds in Vienna. Hundreds of thousands cheered the arrival, swastika flags covered the boulevards. The international community only protested with words. Not a single shot was fired. Germany had expanded its borders, incorporating 8 million people and Austria's resources. The belief that everything could be achieved without war was further reinforced. But Hitler did not stop. The next target was Czechoslovakia, especially the Sudetenland, home to millions of ethnic Germans. A propaganda campaign was launched. Newspapers, speakers, and Nazi politicians broadcast claims of the oppression of Germans in Sudetenland. In reality, this was a ploy to exert international pressure. From the summer of 1938, the crisis escalated. London and Paris, fearing war, sought to negotiate. The Munich Agreement in September 1938 became a turning point. British Prime Minister Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Daladier met Mussolini and Hitler in Munich. The Czechoslovakian government was not present. After many hours of negotiation, Britain and France accepted the cession of the Sudetenland to Germany to preserve peace. Chamberlain returned to London, holding a piece of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." But for Hitler, this was an absolute diplomatic victory. He had subjugated two major powers without firing a shot. The occupation of the Sudetenland not only provided a fortified industrial region, but also rendered Czechoslovakia defenseless. A few months later, in March 1939, Hitler acted again. German troops marched into Prague, transforming the rest of Czechoslovakia into occupied territory. A nation disappeared from the map of Europe. This was the first time Hitler's ambitions went beyond the pretext of national self-determination. It was no longer about reclaiming ethnic German communities, but a blatant act of expansion. This action completely altered the diplomatic landscape. Britain and France realized that appeasement would not stop Hitler. London immediately issued a guarantee to protect Poland, signaling that next time, they would not stand by. From a position of consistently achieving victory without punishment, Hitler now faced the real threat of full-scale war. Looking back at the period 1938–1939, we see a chain of paradoxes. Crowds in Vienna enthusiastically welcomed him. People in the Sudetenland cheered. The international community appeased to avoid bloodshed. But the result was that nations disappeared, borders were erased. Europe's fragile order was shattered by a series of reckless decisions. The silence of the Western powers unwittingly fueled Hitler's hunger, making him believe nothing could stop him. But it was precisely the swallowing of Czechoslovakia that revealed his true nature. This was not just a struggle for Germans beyond the borders, but a plan for unlimited expansion. For Britain and France, all illusions of reconciliation collapsed. No longer peace for our time, but a vow to prepare for confrontation. After swallowing Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Hitler turned his gaze to Poland. For him, this nation was an obstacle on the path to eastward expansion. Demands were issued: return the port city of Danzig, allow the construction of an extraterritorial corridor connecting Germany to East Prussia. These proposals were couched in diplomatic language, but were, in essence, ultimatums. Warsaw refused, and this pushed Europe to a point of no return. The international reaction this time was different. Britain and France immediately declared guarantees of Poland's security, a move unimaginable just months earlier. Hitler was enraged but did not stop. He needed to break the encirclement, and the solution came from the east. In August 1939, the world was stunned to hear of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed in Moscow. Two seemingly opposing regimes, fascist and communist, shook hands. Outwardly, this was a non-aggression pact, promising not to attack each other. But secretly hidden within was a secret protocol. Stalin and Hitler divided Eastern Europe, Poland would be split in two, and the Baltic states and Bessarabia would fall into Soviet hands. For Hitler, this pact was a shield. His rear was secured, no need to worry about a two-front war. For Stalin, it was an opportunity to gain territory and buy time for preparation. Only a few days remained until war. The final days of peace were filled with suffocating tension in Berlin. Hitler ordered total preparation. In Warsaw, the government tried to reassure its people, but knew the storm was coming. Diplomacy continued until the last minute, but it was all a charade. While negotiations had not yet concluded, armored divisions were ready to cross the border. On the morning of September 1, 1939, war erupted. German troops began with a staged incident. SS soldiers, disguised as Polish troops, attacked the Gleichschaltung radio station to create a pretext. Immediately afterward, numerous armored divisions crossed the border. Bombers pounded Warsaw and major cities. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, was unleashed for the first time. Mechanized columns swept through, shattering all defenses. Within days, Polish forces were pushed back along the entire front. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The bells of World War rang again after 2 decades. But this time, the scale and intensity would far surpass the previous conflict. From Berlin, Hitler declared to the Reichstag that, from now on, no one can stop Germany. The crowds cheered, while outside, fire and smoke spread across Eastern Europe. This beginning was full of paradoxes. Hitler did not desire a global war at that moment. He believed that, like previous times, his opponents would falter. But the invasion of Poland crossed a red line. London and Paris could not concede further. In that moment, the string of bloodless victories ended, and Germany plunged into a war that would ultimately consume itself. For the German people, many still believed in the myth of revival. They rejoiced at the first victories, believing their leader brought glory. But they did not yet know that the war that had just begun would turn into a global catastrophe, lasting 6 years and destroying tens of millions of lives. As the sun rose on September 1, 1939, a new world opened with the roar of tanks and falling bombs. The collapse of Poland happened so swiftly that observers in Europe barely had time to breathe. German forces unleashed the Blitzkrieg strategy, applied comprehensively for the first time. Motorized infantry, panzer tanks, and the Luftwaffe coordinated like a torrent of fire, sweeping away everything. Poland's traditional defenses were torn apart, unable to adjust. In less than 4 weeks, Poland was engulfed in flames, its army shattered, its government in flight. On September 17th, the Red Army streamed in from the east, executing the secret protocol with Berlin, dividing the territory. A nation disappeared, making way for a cold-blooded agreement between 2 dictatorships. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but declaration did not mean immediate action in the West. The phony war began. Guns had fired in Eastern Europe, but along the Franco-German border, there was prolonged silence. French troops remained entrenched behind the Maginot Line. British soldiers arrived on the continent merely for defense. For months, the press mocked it as a sitting war, while Hitler used the time to consolidate his forces. This paradox revealed the impotence of the West declaring war, but not daring to fight, allowing Germany a free hand to plan its next move. In April 1940, Hitler turned northward. The campaign in Denmark and Norway was not just about occupying land. From Norway, Germany controlled Swedish iron ore supplies and northern European sea lanes. Denmark fell in hours. Norway resisted longer but was eventually conquered. The German navy suffered losses, but the campaign was a strategic success. Supply lines were secured, and audacity continued to prove one thing: no nation was quick enough to stop Germany when Blitzkrieg was deployed. Then came the conquest of France, one of the century's most tragic dramas. All eyes believed French and British forces would hold thanks to the Maginot Line, a strong defensive network built over a decade. But Hitler did not attack head-on. He repeated a maneuver from 1914, but with a daring twist. He launched his armored forces through the Ardennes forest, an area thought to be impassable. In just days, German tanks surged through, encircling Anglo-French forces at Dunkirk. Paris panicked. The government collapsed. In June, France signed an armistice. Half the country was occupied, the other half became a puppet government in Vichy. An empire that was once a symbol of Europe fell in just 6 weeks. The shock surpassed all predictions. Amidst the dust of victory, Hitler then set about forcing Britain to its knees. He planned Operation Sea Lion, an amphibious invasion across the English Channel. To prepare, the Luftwaffe launched its air campaign. The Battle of Britain proved for the first time that Blitzkrieg was not infallible. The British Royal Air Force, with its radar and fighting spirit, held its skies. Month after month, the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on London and Coventry, but Britain did not collapse. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. This was Germany's first strategic defeat in the war. A small but resolute nation had halted a seemingly unstoppable machine. The period from 1939 to mid-1940 exposed a brutal reality. Germany continuously won, nations fell one after another, while democratic powers reacted slowly, clumsily. But it was precisely during this period that the seeds of reversal began to glimmer. Britain's survival as an outpost, where Blitzkrieg was stopped, and Hitler's absolute self-confidence after Poland, Norway, and France had met its first limit against the skies of London. After France fell, Hitler looked westward with bitterness. Britain still stood firm. Despite nights of blazing bombs in London, despite the abandoned invasion plan, he believed the island nation would eventually be subdued by blockade and bombardment. But in reality, Britain had proven it could resist. Therefore, Hitler's gaze gradually shifted eastward, where he believed the empire's destiny lay. Operation Barbarossa became the largest plan of Hitler's life. From the autumn of 1940, the German army began preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union. He considered this the decisive battle, to annihilate the communist enemy and seize living space. Generals were summoned to hear the Führer declare, "Just kick down the door, and the whole rotten structure will collapse." In his calculations, the campaign would end in just a few months, before winter. At dawn on June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers poured across the border, launching the largest attack in history. The Red Army was completely surprised. In the initial weeks, Blitzkrieg proved terribly effective. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were encircled and captured. Leningrad was besieged. German troops advanced close to Moscow. On maps, everything seemed as if Germany was repeating the French miracle of 1940, this time on a far grander scale. But then, the Russian winter and tenacious resistance changed everything. By late 1941, as snow covered tanks, freezing them, and German soldiers were exhausted in the biting cold, the Red Army counterattacked from Moscow. Divisions drawn from Siberia, trained and equipped for the ice, unexpectedly drove German forces back from the capital's outskirts. The belief in a lightning victory collapsed. From a 3-month expedition, the Eastern Front became a protracted war of attrition lasting many years. Even at that moment, another global event occurred. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the maelstrom. In just days, the U.S. Congress declared war on Japan, then on Germany and Italy. From a logistical supplier, the U.S. became a direct adversary. Its colossal industrial capacity steel, aircraft, warships began to shift into war production. America's entry not only added forces but also forged a new alliance. Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. 3 great powers now confronted Germany. The end of 1941 was a sign of reversal. In the skies over Moscow, the myth of Blitzkrieg's invincibility was broken. On the oceans, Britain still stood firm. Washington, a colossal industrial power, had just entered the fray. For the first time since the war began, Hitler no longer held complete initiative. However, many in Berlin still believed the war was not lost. The Führer reassured them that setbacks were only temporary, that the Eastern campaign would resume with new forces. But in truth, the German economy began to strain. Supply lines in Russia stretched for thousands of kilometers, and the anti-fascist alliance was coordinating ever more closely. The balance of war was slowly but surely shifting. In early 1942, Berlin still believed the winter failure was merely a stumble. Hitler ordered reorganization, deploying more troops and weapons. The target this time was not Moscow, but the South and the Caucasus oil region. The logic was simple: seize the oil, and the war could be prolonged. Capture the city named after Stalin, and that would be the most severe blow to the Soviet Union's morale. German forces advanced southeast, sweeping through a series of encirclement battles, and by summer had reached the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad began as a conventional attack but quickly devolved into a meat grinder. Every street, every building became a Red Army fortress. Under the order, not one step back, soldiers clung to every room. German troops advanced, but every meter of ground was paid for in blood. The city was in ruins, but the will to defend hardened. In late 1942, while Paulus's Sixth Army was bogged down in the rubble, the Red Army counterattacked. Operation Uranus encircled the entire German force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped. Hitler forbade retreat, promising air supplies a promise that could not be kept. By February 1943, Paulus surrendered. Over 300,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. For the first time, a main army group of the Wehrmacht was completely annihilated. The myth of invincibility vanished right in the city named after Stalin. At the same time, in northwest Africa, El Alamein marked the end of the Axis's desert ambitions. Rommel's Afrika Corps had advanced deep, threatening the Suez Canal. But from the summer of 1942, British forces under Montgomery were reinforced, with increased artillery and tanks. In October, the decisive battle erupted. Tens of thousands of tanks, mortars, and artillery pounded the desert. After 10 days, British forces broke through the front. Rommel was forced to retreat, leaving thousands of prisoners and armor at El Alamein. The world saw for the first time the Axis clearly defeated in a major battle on the Western Front. Two simultaneous defeats: Stalingrad in the east, El Alamein in the south, marked the end of Germany's phase of total offensive. From here, the initiative shifted to the Allies. In Eastern Europe, the Red Army began a long series of counteroffensives. In North Africa, the Allies opened the way to Italy. At sea, America's industrial might began to take effect. Warships and aircraft surged across the oceans. The balance of war shifted not only on the map, but also in public perception. The world realized the Third Reich could be defeated. The paradox was this: Hitler's overreaching ambition drove him into a dead end. Instead of concentrating, he spread his forces thin, gambling on decisive battles without fully calculating the consequences. Stalingrad and El Alamein were not just two names on a map, but proof of the limits of violent power. From 1942, Germany's path no longer ascended, but steadily slid downhill. After a string of military victories, Hitler began to establish a system of governance that enveloped the continent. The New Order was not an abstract idea, but a colossal machine operated by iron will, terror, and unlimited exploitation. From the Spanish border to the Russian border, every region was categorized into Berlin's administrative scheme. Any nation that retained a semblance of government was merely an empty shell, stifled by Nazi advisors, secret police, and German-imposed laws. Economic exploitation and forced labor were the pillars sustaining the war machine. Millions of tons of coal, iron, food, and oil were extracted from occupied territories. But the most brutal aspect was the fate of human beings. Millions of laborers were forcibly taken to German factories. French, Polish, Ukrainian workers, even miners. All were pushed into the production lines of weapons under harsh conditions. For them, death from starvation, disease, and industrial accidents occurred daily, coldly, as an inevitable step in the industrial plan. The German war machine operated thanks to human beings transformed into soulless tools. In terms of political control, the SS and Gestapo were two knives plunged deep into every community. They were not just military forces, but a state within a state, running concentration camps, organizing resettlements, and implementing genocidal policies. The secret police sowed invisible fear. A mere whisper could make someone disappear in the night. Obedience was maintained not by conviction, but by perpetual anxiety. Concentration camps and the extermination network were the darkest symbols, from Dachau and Buchenwald to Auschwitz. They were not merely places of detention, but laboratories of systematic destruction. Political prisoners, dissenting intellectuals, Jews, Roma, homosexuals all were drawn into a spiral of labor until death or killed immediately upon stepping off the train. Here, evil was no longer an impulsive act but an industrial chain, where humans were categorized, numbered, then vanished in the smoke of crematoria. The New Order was, in essence, a continent-wide killing factory. Yet not all places remained silent. Resistance and repression formed a repeating cycle. In France, the Netherlands and Norway underground groups organized sabotage, assassinations, and printed leaflets. In Eastern Europe, partisan movements and underground armies operated fiercely, but each act of retaliation brought tenfold terror from Germany. Villages were burned, hostages executed en masse. Oradour-sur-Glane in France and Litis in Czechoslovakia are names etched in memory, where entire communities were obliterated to sow fear. Terror became the regime's sole political language for its opponents. Hitler's New Order painted itself as a superior civilization, but in reality, it was a colossal prison where freedom was stolen, where millions lived like ghosts in a cycle of labor and terror. The paradox here is that while Germany on the front lines celebrated spectacular victories, in the rear, those victories were only sustained by the systematic destruction of the very people being ruled. From 1941 to 1943, as the front lines turned unfavorably, the exploitative system grew even more ruthless. Germany needed more labor, more food, more weapons, and their only answer was to tighten the chains, expand the camps, and intensify arrests. Trains packed with people ran day and night, carrying millions more lives into the machinery of destruction. The picture of the New Order revealed a bitter truth. Not glory, but cruelty and terror were the foundations of the Third Reich. And it was in this very cruelty that the seeds of resistance spread, nourishing the determination of occupied peoples to fight back. The New Order was both a temporary strength and the deep-seated cause of its own collapse. 1943 opened in an atmosphere vastly different from the early days of the war. The defeat in North Africa marked the complete retreat of the Axis. Tunisia fell in May. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. For Italy, this was not just a military loss, but a blow to its already dwindling pride. Mussolini, who once stood beside Hitler as a fascist pioneer, now became a weak ally, a burden for Berlin. Mussolini's health also reflected the situation. He was tired, sick, tormented by stomach ulcers, gradually losing energy. Meanwhile, the Italian people suffered from famine, Allied bombs rained down on cities, and faith in the regime wavered. Slogans and parades that once inflamed crowds were now just empty echoes. Italy was exhausted, both physically and spiritually. Within the power structure, discontent erupted. Generals realized that clinging to Hitler meant suicide. The fascist Grand Council, which had previously only offered praise, now secretly prepared a counterblow. On the night of July 24-25, 1943, they convened in a tense atmosphere. Each member spoke, criticizing policies that had led the country to disaster. The vote result was shocking. A majority approved a motion to strip Mussolini of his powers, transferring control to the king and the army. The betrayal came from his closest circle. The next morning, Mussolini still thought he controlled the situation. He went to meet King Victor Emmanuel, expecting to discuss plans to counter the Allies, but instead, the king coldly informed him he had been replaced. At the gate of the residence, carabinieri awaited. Mussolini was placed in an ambulance, driven away in silence, an era collapsed in a moment. That image was symbolic. The man who once stood on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia, hand raised high, shouting about a new Roman Empire, now quietly vanished like a prisoner. The career he built with impassioned rhetoric and street violence now collapsed under the weight of military defeat and political betrayal. The consequences for the Axis were irreversible. Allied forces entered Sicily in July, opening the way onto the peninsula. Italy plunged into chaos. The new government hastily negotiated with the Allies, while Germany immediately intervened, occupying northern Italy to maintain influence. Hitler no longer had a true ally, but only a chaotic territory he was forced to bear. For the Italian people, the event was both a shock and a liberation. The fascist regime, which had donned a glamorous facade for 2 decades, now revealed its rottenness. But at the same time, German intervention turned Italy into a battlefield, where the populace endured more bombing, starvation, and a covert civil war between resistance forces and remaining fascist loyalists. Mussolini's fall was paradoxical. The co-founder of the fascist movement, once a role model for Hitler, was betrayed and abandoned by his own comrades when he became a burden. This not only weakened the Axis, but also revealed a brutal truth. Power built on vanity and terror would also disintegrate in isolation and shame. The summer of 1944, a pivotal moment in history, opened with an unprecedented battle. The Normandy landings, D-Day on June 6, 1944, was the largest military operation in human history. At dawn, thousands of warships, landing craft, and aircraft from Britain crossed the English Channel. The beaches of Normandy, Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword became the focal points. American, British, and Canadian troops stormed ashore while artillery fire and bombs rained down on German defenses. Casualties were heavy, especially at Omaha, but they secured a foothold. From here, a new front opened in the heart of Europe, forcing German forces to fight in a pincer movement. From the east, the Red Army pressed on. From the west, the Allies advanced. Germany had no strategic escape. The failure to prevent D-Day clearly exposed Germany's command crisis. Generals were divided on troop deployment. Rommel argued for immediate interception at the beaches, while Gerd von Rundstedt believed in holding reserves for a later counterattack. Hitler, the final decision-maker, hesitated, haunted by misleading intelligence from Allied deception campaigns. He believed the real invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais. Therefore, when Normandy erupted, reserves were held back too long. The opportunity for a counterattack slipped away, and the front gradually crumbled. From here, the Allies had a springboard to liberate France. While the war tightened externally, dangerous conspiracies also erupted within Germany. Assassination plots against Hitler had emerged before, but by 1943–1944, they became more determined. From officers who foresaw defeat to old political figures, all sought to eliminate the Führer to save the country from destruction. Many plans were laid: time bombs on planes, explosives hidden in gifts, pistols at meetings. But luck or carelessness always foiled them. The climax was the July 20th plot in 1944. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a wounded officer who had lost an eye and a hand, carried a bomb into a meeting at the Wolf's Lair headquarters. He placed the briefcase containing the bomb right under the table near Hitler, then left the room. The explosion collapsed the roof, killing many officers, but Hitler was only lightly wounded. The coup plan in Berlin collapsed in hours. Stauffenberg and his comrades were executed. Thousands of others were arrested and executed. The failed plot only caused Hitler to tighten internal terror, shattering hopes for change from within. The paradox of 1944 lies in the fact that externally, Germany was cornered, while internally, there were individuals who dared to sacrifice themselves to end the regime but could not succeed. The Allied military might gradually liberated Paris, advanced close to the German border, while the Red Army crushed the Eastern Front. But Hitler still clung to life and power, turning Germany itself into a battlefield, forcing its people to pay the ultimate price. D-Day and the assassination attempt on Hitler were both turning points. One marked the return of freedom to the continent, the other showed that even within the regime, a will for resistance existed. Both signaled the impending end of the Third Reich. From the summer of 1944, there were no more illusions. Berlin merely awaited its fall, and Hitler only prolonged the inevitable with bloodshed. When the desperate Ardennes counteroffensive failed, Germany's fate was sealed. The consequences after the Battle of the Bulge were clear. Tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft were lost. Reserves were depleted. Hitler's final offensive, once hoped to divide the Allies and force negotiations, now became a disaster, causing the Western Front to collapse. From March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine at Remagen. An accidental miracle occurred. the Ludendorff Bridge, seemingly destined to collapse, still stood when American troops arrived. They poured across, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. In just days, tens of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and artillery crossed, opening the door into the heart of Germany. For the German people, the image of Allied troops crossing the Rhine, a river once a thousand-year symbol of defense, was a signal that war had entered their homes. The Ruhr, Germany's most important industrial region, where steel, coal, and weapons were produced, became a colossal encirclement. General Eisenhower chose not to advance directly to Berlin as many expected, but ordered the encirclement of the Ruhr. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were trapped. The industrial lifeblood of the empire was cut off. In those short days, a region once vibrant with steel mills and factories fell silent, only the roar of artillery and columns of prisoners remaining. The disintegration was no longer on campaign maps, but within the nation's economic body itself. While Anglo-American forces advanced, a new myth spread: the Alpine Redoubt, a last stronghold in the mountains where the Nazis would make their final stand and prolong resistance. This rumor concerned not a few commanders, causing them to disperse their forces. In reality, it was merely a product of propaganda and illusion. There was no impregnable fortress in the Alps, only a few half-finished bunkers and empty threats. But the power of the rumor caught the Allies off guard, showing that even in its dying moments, the regime still knew how to sow illusions. On the ground, Allied forces liberated industrial cities one by one: Cologne, St. Lo, Frankfurt. These cities, once the industrial pride of Germany, were now piles of rubble. Residents hid in bunkers, watching as white-starred tanks rolled through. Places that once echoed with the clang of steel now only heard sighs and the skeletons of factories. Germany, which once put Europe under its heel, was now a battlefield for others. By April, American and British forces pressed against the Elbe in northern Germany. They captured Bremen and Hamburg, cutting off the route to Denmark, isolating German forces in Scandinavia. In the center, they rapidly advanced through Hanover and Leipzig. The North Sea coast and the fertile plains were now in enemy hands. The roads that once carried German conquerors now became the only escape routes for fleeing civilians. The feelings of the German people at this time were paradoxical. On one hand, they feared the bombings, the revenge that would come. But on the other hand, many began to breathe a sigh of relief because the end was very near. In the darkness of bunkers and rubble, some whispered, "Better the Americans come first than the Russians." This very longing would become an undercurrent in the final days, shaping the choices of generals about to surrender. After the Western Front collapsed, in the East, the true power that would decide Germany's fate was prepared. The Red Army's winter offensive of 1945 unleashed a series of simultaneous battles from the Vistula-Oder line with unprecedented forces. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks, artillery, and aircraft were unleashed. Nazi Germany, exhausted after Stalingrad, Kursk, and hundreds of bloody battles, now faced a red tsunami that swept away all defenses. East Prussia, Pomerania regions once proudly thought of as ancient defensive lines collapsed one after another. Vienna fell on April 13, 1945. The Austrian capital, once the center of an old empire, now became a Red Army trophy. Its Baroque streets were torn apart by bombs. The theaters and squares, once brilliantly lit, were now covered in dust and ash. The loss of Vienna was not just military. It was proof that southern Germany, Bavaria, and Bohemia were now also exposed. The cultural cradle of Central Europe, once home to immortal music, was now engulfed in the roar of cannons and the cries of refugees. Meanwhile, the two pincers closed in. From the east, Konev and Zhukov's forces pressed toward Berlin. From the west, American and British forces rapidly advanced to the Elbe. On April 25 at Torgau, the two armies met. The handshake on the small bridge became a symbol of East meeting West, ending the Nazi nightmare. But before that, Berlin was still the final target. Munich, the political and cultural symbol of the Nazi Party, fell into Allied hands. Where once magnificent parades and fervent oaths took place, now lay piles of rubble. American troops raised the stars and stripes on the government building, where previously a giant swastika banner had flown. Munich, the birthplace of the Nazi Party, where Hitler began his political career, was now in Allied hands. Symbols that once projected power now became evidence of collapse. The German people lived in a state of turmoil. In East Prussia, hundreds of thousands fled westward, hoping to escape the Red Army. Roads were choked with horse-drawn carts, bicycles, and streams of walking refugees. Many columns were attacked by aircraft. Death was rampant on the escape routes. In Berlin, residents clearly heard the artillery echoing from the east. Day by day, hour by hour, fear of the Red Army became an obsession, and many prayed for the Americans to arrive first. German defenses shattered, the army lacked supplies, generals ran out of options. But Hitler's stubbornness and the loyal apparatus still prolonged the war. Battles no longer held strategic meaning, only delaying death. In northern Germany, Hamburg fell. In the south, Bavaria and Tyrol were threatened. The encirclement tightened with every short interval. While Zhukov prepared to attack Berlin directly from the east, Konev pressed from the south. American troops had reached the Elbe but halted, not entering the capital, in accordance with Allied agreements. This placed the final burden on the Red Army, to capture Berlin, ending the war in Europe. The roar of cannons from the suburbs already echoed in every street, signaling that the capital city of the Third Reich was about to become a colossal graveyard. As we conclude the dense journey of this book, we cannot simply view it as a mere chronicle of war. It is a dark mirror, reflecting the grim depths of human nature when power, fear, and ambition combine. The first lesson is not in the horrific numbers of casualties, but in how a civilized society, rich in academic and artistic traditions like Germany, could slide into the abyss of dictatorship simply because the masses were willing to vote for hatred disguised as pride. We often think such tragedies only occur in backward societies, but history proves otherwise. The more confident we are that we are immune, the more easily we fall into the trap. The second lesson comes from the very mechanics of power. The Nazi regime did not rise overnight. It was built from small compromises, from the silence of those who knew but dared not speak, from concessions that seemed harmless, until all freedoms were stripped away, until independent voices were suppressed, and by then, it was too late to turn back. Here, the terrifying thing is not one dictator, but the silent, consenting majority. Have you ever wondered if, in our current lives, there are places where we are repeating that silence? The third lesson lies in the fragility of international order. Treaties, commitments once considered inviolable, were broken with just a few reckless steps. And the surprising thing was that no one dared to act. The hesitation and fear of war from Britain and France became fertile ground for Hitler's expansion. The paradox here is that the very desire to preserve peace fostered a war that was infinitely more brutal. The question arises, are we in some corner trading justice for short-term tranquility, and what will be the true cost later? The fourth lesson comes from collective deception. Propaganda was not merely a tool, but the oxygen that sustained the regime. It didn't need to convince everyone, just sow enough fear and enough illusion. Flags, songs, and glamorous images made millions believe they were serving a noble ideal, while in reality, they were helping build a machinery of destruction. Try to think, in today's world, with the torrent of information, are you sure you can distinguish between truth and illusion? The final, and perhaps most profound, tragic lesson is the impotence of reason when humans allow fear and hatred to control them. How many intellectuals, generals, and civil servants realized the path was leading to disaster, but either they were captivated, or they convinced themselves that the time was not yet right, or they hoped they could restrain the dictator. By the time they realized, it was too late. Silence, unwitting complicity, killed no less than bullets. What do you think? In our everyday decisions, are we delaying due to fear, and then allowing terrible things to become reality? Throughout the entire journey of the Third Reich, we see a paradox. What is built on violence and hatred can achieve short-term victories, but will ultimately self-destruct from within. Hitler's death in the Berlin bunker was not just the end of an individual, but proof that arrogance and the absolutization of power ultimately lead to ashes. So, after all, the question for you is, what do we learn for the present? When you see injustice, do you choose silence or do you speak up? When faced with dazzling promises, are you sober enough to distinguish between truth and fabrication? When confronted with fear, do you let it control you, or do you transform it into strength to act? This journey is not just for us to mourn the past, but to ask ourselves, what will we do to prevent it from repeating in the future?